Once at a dinner party, the famous Italian film actor Marcello Mastroianni unexpectedly began singing an old song that had been forgotten by almost everyone. The song had the following lines: "The house where I was so happy burned down." Soon after the actor finished singing, the phone rang. Marcello Mastroianni was called to the phone. At the other end of the line, he was told that his villa, which was located on the very shore of the Mediterranean Sea, had burned down. There are a huge number of stories with similar incredible coincidences. Astronomer and popularizer of science Camille Flammarion devoted his attention to this problem. In one of his works, this French scientist described many amazing cases associated with coincidences and tried to give his own explanation for them. According to the scientist's observations, events in which strange coincidences can be traced happen in the life of every person. Camille Flammarion was no exception. So, one summer day, the scientist was working in his office. Camille Flammarion was in a hurry to finish another chapter of the book Atmosphere. This chapter was dedicated to the wind. It was hot outside, so the scientist opened 2 windows in his office. Camille Flammarion was so absorbed in his work that he did not notice how it was getting dark outside. A large cloud covered the entire sky. A strong wind blew, which happens before the rain, and carried away the manuscript of the chapter by Camille Flammarion, lying on the table. A moment later, pouring rain poured down. The scientist understood that there was no point in leaving the house to save the manuscript. He considered it lost. Imagine my surprise when, a few days after what happened, I received an envelope sent to me by the Ligure printing house. In this envelope I saw a print of that very lost chapter. It was printed in full. Let's not forget that in it I described curious facts about the wind, said Camille Flammarion. What happened that day? An employee of the Ligure printing house went to have lunch. On his way back to work, he passed by Flammarion's house, which was not far from the printing house. The passerby saw pages on the ground, written in a familiar handwriting. He thought that he had lost the manuscript. Fearing punishment, the frightened employee immediately began to collect the soaked pages, and then took them to the printing house. Here is another example from the life of an astronomer. Camille Flammarion intended to fly in a hot air balloon after his wedding with his wife. The scientist promised the priest who was to marry the young couple to take him on this excursion. 10 days after the wedding, Flammarion went to the priest's home to tell him that the balloon flight would take place the following day. However, the scientist was told that the owner of the house had left Paris for a few days to relax in a country house on the banks of the Marne. Camille Flammarion decided to go on an excursion by air without a priest. The scientist decided to invite him on this trip another time. There are many directions for a balloon that takes off over Paris. But that day, it was treacherously carried towards the banks of the Marne. At some point, Flammarion noticed that he and his wife were flying right over the priest's summer house. The latter was in the garden at that moment. Of course, he noticed the balloon. The priest thought that Camille Flammarion had flown right to his summer house for him. He was restlessly rushing back and forth in his garden, trying to point out the best place for the balloon to land. At that moment, Flammarion felt terribly awkward in front of the priest. He saw how he became desperate when the balloon floated past his summer house and flew on. The scientist recalled, "Then it seemed to me that the devil himself played such a cruel joke on me, although I understood that the path of the balloon depended only on the random direction of the wind." Of course, such strange coincidences happened not only to Camille Flammarion, but also to his acquaintances. The French poet and playwright Émile Deschamps once told the scientist about a series of strange coincidences in his life. It all began when Émile Deschamps was still a child. One day, an acquaintance of his came to visit his parents, Mr. Fontgibu, who had lived in England for a long time. This man treated Émile to plum pudding, a traditional English Christmas dessert. At that time, this dish was not popular in France. Many years passed. Émile Deschamps forgot about this treat and about Mr. Fontgibu. One day, the poet was passing by a restaurant and saw a pudding in the window that looked very appetizing. Deschamps decided to go into the restaurant and order this dish. But the waiter replied that the plum pudding had already been ordered by another visitor. The visitor who ordered this dish heard the dialogue between Deschamps and the waiter. He kindly offered his order to the poet. And although Émile Deschamps declined this offer, he decided to have a short conversation with the kind visitor for the sake of propriety. When the latter introduced himself, the poet was temporarily speechless. Because this visitor turned out to be the same Mr. Fontgibu, who had once been a guest in the Deschamps house. The poet barely recognized this aged man. And that is not the end of the story. A few years after this incident, Émile Deschamps was invited to visit. That evening, English plum pudding was served at the table. Émile Deschamps entertained the company by telling stories connected with this dish. Then he turned to the hostess of the house with the question, "I hope you invited Mr. Fontgibu?" Laughter rang out at the table. Not much time passed before a footman entered the guest room and announced that Mr. Fontgibu had arrived. The room became quiet. Amidst the deathly silence, an embarrassed old man with a cane in his hands soon appeared in the drawing room. Émile Deschamps, of course, recognized him. "I felt the hair on my head stand on end," the poet wrote later in his diary. "I think that Don Juan was not as frightened by the appearance of the stone guest as I was by the appearance of Mr. Fontgibu. However, the appearance of my acquaintance was explained quite simply. The fact is that Mr. Fontgibu was indeed invited to visit that evening. But he was a guest at another house. The old man simply made a mistake in the address." Concluding his work on amazing coincidences, Camille Flammarion suggested that in fact our actions in everyday life, our beliefs and decisions are governed by probabilities. However, the scientist called these probabilities not mathematical, but moral. And it is these probabilities that lead to such amazing coincidences that simply cannot be accidental. Everything in our life happens for a reason. All the coincidences I have cited are so unlikely that one can assume that there is some law behind them that governs these coincidences. It is impossible to confirm this assumption scientifically, because it is impossible to reproduce such cases at will. But not believing in them is the same as not believing in lightning, because we cannot recreate it when we want it. Or not believing in an eclipse, because it cannot be reproduced at will, explained Camille Flammarion.